On his 80th birthday, Walter Brewster laced up his walking shoes like he did every morning, except today, something felt off. The laces, a bit stiffer in the autumn chill, resisted his usual double knot, and he paused, glancing at the framed photo of Ethan perched on the shelf above the shoe bench. The boy was 10 in that picture, beaming with a missing front tooth and holding a fishing rod twice his size. For 2 decades, Ethan had shown up for birthday breakfasts, early and eager. This year, Walter had only received a call the night before. "Work's a mess, Grandpa. I'll make it up to you. Promise." He'd chuckled, masking the pinch. Clark Pines in early October had a rhythm as steady as the church bell across town. Golden leaves clung stubbornly to the oak trees, crisp air carried the smell of Millie's morning apple bakes, and porches creaked with the quiet shuffle of retirees greeting another day. Walter zipped up his windbreaker, adjusted the collar, and stepped out, closing the cabin door with that familiar click, solid, well-built, the kind of thing you don't expect to betray you. He waved at Mr. Leland watering chrysanthemums 2 doors down and paused as Captain, the spry terrier with too much energy for his size, came bounding toward him on an invisible leash. "Morning, Walter," Gloria Harper's voice rang from the porch, even before he saw her. She stood perfectly upright, clipboard in one hand, her red snowflake sweater startlingly bright against the muted landscape. "You know the HOA reviewed porch standards again. That shade of blue on your railing? It's not compliant. We're going with a more neutral palette this season, soft sage, oyster shell, things that blend." Walter bent to pet Captain, who whined and leaned into his touch. "Good morning, Gloria. Lovely sweater." He straightened, gave a polite nod, and moved along without engaging further. The route to Millie's cafe was as familiar to him as the back of his hand. Each crack in the sidewalk, every leaning mailbox, spoke of years quietly past. The cafe's door chimed its tinny bell as he entered, warmth and cinnamon wrapping around him. Millie was already bustling behind the counter, short curls pinned back, jazz playing low from the radio tucked beside the cash register. "Well, if it isn't my birthday boy," she called, eyes twinkling. "Same corner table?" "Unless someone finally steals it," Walter replied, shrugging off his jacket and settling into the wooden booth that bore a permanent dent from his visits. She brought him a small cupcake, pink candle already lit. A couple of regulars clapped softly, and Walter gave a sheepish grin. "I'll blow it out, but no promises about wishes." "You're too steady for surprises," Millie teased. "But hey, 80 deserves something big." He chuckled, then leaned back, soaking in the morning chatter, the scrape of forks on plates, the sound of a world not yet rushed. After finishing his usual, 2 poached eggs and wheat toast, he walked home slower than usual, pausing to admire the way sunlight filtered through a canopy of amber leaves. The envelope sat alone on his doorstep, perfectly centered, sealed with that neat HOA logo, a pinecone enclosed in a triangle. He unlocked the door, stepped inside, and placed it on the kitchen counter. Coffee first, he thought. A moment more with the ordinary. Steam rose from the pot as he stood by the window, watching a squirrel investigate his railing. He reached for the peanut butter and a slice of toast, spreading it evenly with the butter knife he always used. Never a spoon, never a reason to switch. By the time he sat down again, the letter waited like an uninvited guest. He opened it. The words were efficient, cold. Notice of eviction, followed by citations of clause violations, non-standard modifications, unauthorized color alterations, failure to comply within regulatory grace period. Effective in 14 days. His toast remained untouched. He folded the paper slowly, the corners crisp against his fingertips. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the leaves on the porch like restless thoughts. Walter stood, letter in hand, walked to the door, and stepped back into the golden morning. "Well, that's new," he murmured, as wind scattered leaves across his porch. The town may have been quiet, but Walter's lawyer instincts had just woken up. The envelope from the HOA sat beside the toaster like a dare. He hadn't practiced in decades, but legal reasoning wasn't something you forgot, like riding a bike or noticing when someone was bluffing. Walter stood at the window, swirling tea in his stoneware mug, steam rising over the bold etching, EST 1987. That mug had seen more arguments resolved than most courtrooms. Outside, clouds gathered low and gray. The wind no longer whispered through the leaves, it pushed. Clark Pines looked unchanged on the surface, but Walter's eyes were trained to catch details, shifts in tone, misplaced certainty. He zipped his jacket and stepped into the chill with a new rhythm in his walk, less aimless and more strategic. The Clark Pines Records office still smelled faintly of lemon polish and dry ink. Its fluorescent lights flickered like they resented being turned on too early. Molly Waters looked up from behind the desk, her long braid draped over one shoulder, cheeks slightly pink from the cold. "Mr. Brewster." Twice in 1 week, she teased gently. "I like to live dangerously," Walter said with a smile. "I'm looking for the HOA charter. Full version, if it exists." She tilted her head. "The full one? That's old. But I think I know where to dig." As she disappeared behind a stack of file cabinets, Walter strolled along the narrow aisle lined with civic documents and dusty binders. A few minutes later, Molly returned, holding a green folder bound with a faded ribbon. "Some of this hasn't been updated in years," she whispered, as though the bylaws might overhear. "It's vague in places. Kind of feels like they wanted it that way." Walter arched an eyebrow and thanked her, taking a seat near the window. The pages crackled as he flipped through them. Article 12, Community Uniformity. The language was all implication, no definition. Structures must reflect the aesthetic sensibilities of the community's majority. No specific colors, no architectural standards, just interpretations. Interpretations that Gloria seemed all too eager to enforce. The knock on his door came just after lunch. He didn't have to look through the peephole, the rhythm was clipped and precise. Gloria Harper, holding her ever-present clipboard, greeted him with a smile thin enough to slip under a door. "Afternoon, Walter. I hope you're finding time to address the porch issue." "I'm looking into it," he said, stepping just enough into the doorway to block her view inside. She flipped to a page. "There are daily fines now. Accumulating, unfortunately. Non-standard elements degrade neighborhood cohesion." He nodded, as if absorbing a weather forecast. "Noted." As she turned to leave, Captain gave a bark from her porch. Gloria pursed her lips. "Oh, and Walter? That cabin of yours, it's becoming a bit of a blemish near the trailhead. We'll need to clean that up." Later that afternoon, Walter found himself passing the library again. Molly stood outside posting a flyer on the bulletin board, "Local book circle, gentle reads and spiced tea, Thursday evening." She noticed him and waved. "You should come. We're reading Where the Heart Waits. Nice pacing, not too dramatic." He smiled politely. "I'm in more of a procedural mood lately." He was about to walk on when his eye caught the lot next door. Weeds curled around cracked concrete, an abandoned parcel with a faded "For Development" sign leaning against the chain-link fence. It had sat untouched for years, right in HOA territory, yet seemingly forgotten. By sundown, Walter stood in Greg Daniels' garage, watching his friend fiddle with a socket wrench. The air was thick with the scent of grease and warm dust, old rock music humming faintly from a battered radio. "Ever feel like someone's rewriting the rules while you're not looking?" Walter asked. Greg grunted, wiped his hands on a rag, and shot him a grin. "All the time. Usually while my back's turned and they're after my tool chest." "What's the HOA up to now?" Walter pulled a folded paper from his jacket. "Time to dust off some legalese." The next morning, Walter visited the post office. The clerk, a man who knew more gossip than the town paper, raised his eyebrows when Walter handed over a thick manila envelope marked certified mail. "Official business?" the man asked, half curious, half joking. "Let's just call it a request for fairness," Walter replied, nodding as the clerk stamped it with a satisfying thunk. The request for arbitration, citing bad faith enforcement and procedural ambiguity, was on its way. That evening, as Walter washed his mug and stared at the dancing flames in the hearth, a soft rustle by the front door caught his attention. He opened it to find nothing but the cool air and a yellow post-it stuck to the screen. In Molly's careful handwriting, it read, "I found something weird in the HOA charter. Want to see?" Sometimes the smallest footnotes make the biggest cracks. Walter adjusted his scarf against the chill and stepped into the Clark Pines library, the bell above the door giving a polite chime. Afternoon sun spilled through the wide windows in fractured beams, catching the dust that hung suspended like slow-moving snow. The scent of pumpkin candles, courtesy of Molly, no doubt, mingled with the faint musk of old paper. She sat at the main table, already waiting, her cracked reading glasses perched askew on her nose. "Found it," she whispered with a mix of triumph and disbelief, holding up a thick binder worn at the edges. Walter settled into the wooden chair opposite her. "Show me the fine print." Molly flipped to a page halfway through the charter. A yellow sticky tab marked the section, Article 7b, Legacy Residency Rights. The clause was buried in a dense paragraph, nearly lost among stipulations about landscaping materials and seasonal lighting. If a resident has maintained uninterrupted residence within Clark Pines for 30 or more years, she read aloud, they are exempt from architectural compliance clauses instituted after their initial occupancy. Walter let out a low whistle. "They'll always overlook the fine print, until it bites." "They sure will," Molly nodded. "The clause has never been challenged. I doubt Gloria even knows it's in here." At that moment, the front door swung open, and Gloria Harper's heels clicked sharply across the library floor. She wore her signature red sweater again, this one patterned with cardinals instead of snowflakes. Her eyes narrowed at the sight of Walter and Molly together. "I wasn't aware this was a town council session," she said, tone cool. Molly closed the binder slowly. "Just catching up on some community history." Gloria's son, Brett, trailed behind her. He hovered near the local bulletin board, holding a folder of HOA paperwork, but didn't move to distribute it. His eyes flicked toward the table, then back down. "Hope you're not stirring trouble, Walter," Gloria added with a tight smile. "Just reading," Walter replied. "You should try it sometime." After Gloria departed, Molly whispered, "Brett's been around more lately. He never used to show up to these things." Walter followed her gaze as Brett stepped back outside, the folder still tucked under one arm. By late afternoon, Walter and Greg met at the small print shop Greg operated from his garage. The old printer made a low whirring noise as it spat out laminated sheets one by one. 12 copies? Greg asked, peeling one from the tray. "You planning to wallpaper the HOA office?" "Park benches, trailheads, the grocery store corkboard," Walter said. "Let people see the rights they forgot they had." Greg smirked. "You're enjoying this." "I'm awake again," Walter admitted. While Greg hung the laminated notices, Walter returned home and prepared another envelope, this one thinner, but equally pointed. The notice of intent to sue wasn't meant to ignite a legal war. It was leverage. A pause button. He walked it to the mailbox himself, making sure it went out with the evening post. Later that night, the phone rang. Walter wasn't expecting anyone. "Grandpa," came the familiar voice of Ethan. "I saw the letter you forwarded. Thought I'd fly in, just check in." Walter leaned against the kitchen counter, caught off guard by the emotion that stirred behind his ribs. "You don't need to do that, Ethan." "Well, too late," Ethan chuckled. "I land Friday." The click of the line ending was followed by silence. Walter held the phone for a moment longer before hanging up. Across town, in the HOA community hall, the lights burned late. Gloria paced near the fireplace, Denise Murray watching her warily from a folding chair. "Legacy rights?" Gloria snapped. "Irrelevant if we change the enforcement window." Denise hesitated. "It's never been enforced during winter, Gloria. It's not what we've done before." Gloria turned sharply. "If Walter won't comply, we may need to accelerate matters." When legal paths hit a wall, Walter chose something older, neighbors helping neighbors. He stepped out into the crisp afternoon, clutching a stack of freshly printed flyers and feeling the familiar ache in his knees that flared when rain was near. The sidewalks of Clark Pines were dappled in gold and rust, with pumpkins on porches and scarecrows swaying lazily in the breeze. Halloween was weeks away, but the decorations had already made themselves at home. Next to him, Molly cradled a covered dish. Banana bread. Just in case people don't open the door for the flyers, she said, smiling. Walter chuckled. Bribery, small-town style. Greg met them at the corner where the old sycamore leaned over the sidewalk. He handed Walter a paper punch stapler. Sheriff Walt, reporting for civic duty. They started down Walnut Street, the homes modest and familiar. The first knock brought out Mr. and Mrs. Langley, the retired teachers. Walter handed them the flyer, "Let's keep Clark Pines home." Molly passed over the banana bread. The Langleys read in silence, then Mr. Langley looked up. About time someone stood up to Gloria. Next was Janine, the postal worker. She leaned against her doorframe, the smell of lavender wafting from her porch. 50 more, she asked after scanning the page. I can run them through the copier at the post office when the rush dies down. Over the next hour, they knocked on 17 doors. 12 residents offered support or shared stories of similar frustrations. One woman recalled being cited for planting daisies instead of marigolds. Another man said he was fined for having a wind chime that exceeded decibel allowance. The quiet murmuring of discontent had begun to find a voice. At number 52, Brett Harper opened the door halfway, eyes cautious. He wore a wrinkled t-shirt and looked like he hadn't slept well. Walter held up the flyer. Just wanted to share this. That's all. Brett didn't take it. I know what it's about. There was a pause. Molly remained silent beside Walter, respectful. Brett exhaled and stepped back. You can come in. Inside, the home was tidy but impersonal, photos of HOA events framed on the wall, a faint citrus cleaner smell. Brett sat on the edge of an armchair while Walter stood, awkward in the quiet. I didn't know they were pushing eviction notices, Brett finally said. I thought it was warnings, the usual stuff. Walter nodded. Sometimes things look usual until they're not. I'll read it, Brett muttered, gesturing to the flyer before standing up and walking them to the door. Outside again, Molly gave Walter a look. That wasn't nothing. They circled back toward the town square, where the old community bulletin board stood near the park benches. Greg met them there, holding up the lone laminated clause still hanging above eye level. No one's taken it down, he said, grinning. Guess they need a ladder. Walter pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket. In his neat, practiced handwriting, he had written. To Gloria, let's talk, neighbor to neighbor, before lawyers do. W. Brewster. He pinned it dead center on the corkboard, smoothing the edges carefully. Message sent, Molly whispered. As the sky dimmed into early evening, Walter walked home alone. The air carried the smell of wood smoke and damp leaves. The path to his cabin crackled underfoot. He paused at the porch, feeling unusually alert. Something about the gate felt off. He walked around the side yard, flashlight in hand. There, near the tool shed, he found it. One length of his low garden fence had been snipped clean through. The wire lay curled like a dropped thread. He didn't say a word. Instead, Walter fetched a pack of zip ties from his shed and knelt in the dirt. Under the pale light of the moon, with only the wind for company, he patched the fence, quiet hands working steady, like they had countless times before. No one knew how the fire started, but its timing lit more than just dry leaves. The air that night was brittle, sharp with cold, the kind that made old joints whisper in protest. Walter sat near his window, sipping weak coffee from a chipped percolator. His faithful machine had surrendered with the power outage that blanketed half of Clark Pines in darkness just after sundown. Then came the smell, smoke, thick and sour, not chimney wood smoke but something electrical, acrid. He stood too quickly and felt it, the familiar tightness in his chest creeping in like an old debt collector. Outside, a glow bloomed near the library. Sirens hadn't started yet, but Greg's voice did, shouting from the corner, flashlight in hand. Fire. Library lot. Molly was already moving across the street, her cardigan flapping behind her. 2 houses down, she pounded on the Langley's door. "Mrs. Langley! You and Harold need to come out, now." Walter forced his legs into motion, crunching over leaves toward the edge of the lot. Sparks licked the air. A utility box hissed with flame, wires snapping like angry whips. Greg, coat unzipped and breathing hard, had already called 911. "I always said that wiring was a tinderbox waiting for a squirrel's sneeze," he muttered. "Didn't think I'd be right." The volunteer fire truck arrived 5 minutes later, red lights washing the trees in panic. Chief Merritt stepped out, a mountain of calm wrapped in canvas and soot. "No injuries?" he barked. "Not yet," Greg said, glancing at Walter, who leaned against a railing, lips pale. "I'm fine," Walter insisted before anyone could speak. "Just winded." Molly gave him a sideways glance but said nothing. The fire was contained quickly, more smoke than damage, but it rattled the town. The power outage lingered into the early morning. By the time Ethan's rideshare turned the final bend toward the cabin, he saw his grandfather crouched by the garden fence with a pair of wire cutters and a flashlight in his mouth. "Grandpa?" Ethan climbed out, duffel in hand. Walter looked up. "Didn't expect you before lunch." "You didn't expect a fire either, I imagine." Walter stood slowly, brushing off his knees. "It's nothing. Just the abandoned lot. They say it was the junction box." Ethan stared at the smudges of ash on his grandfather's cuffs. "Why are you out here fixing a fence?" "Because it's mine," Walter said simply. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of smoke and burnt coffee. A candle flickered on the mantel. Ethan dropped his bag near the sofa and sat without taking off his coat. "You didn't call," he said. "You'd have come racing out," Walter replied. "And you were already on your way." Later that day, a new HOA memo arrived in every mailbox, printed neatly on letterhead, recent unrest linked to resident advocacy groups. "We urge calm, cooperation, and adherence to HOA protocol." Greg read it aloud on Walter's porch, scoffing. "Unrest? What are we, a student protest in '68? Molly sipped lukewarm tea beside him. "They're rattled. That's what this is." Inside, the phone rang. Ethan picked it up, listened for a moment, then stiffened. "This is Ethan Brewster," he said. "Ah, Ethan. Gloria Harper here," came the voice, crisp and measured. "We haven't met, but I've always admired your grandfather." "Truly. That's why I'm reaching out. Perhaps, out of love, you might consider helping him transition. Assisted living, perhaps. For his safety." Ethan said nothing for a long moment. Then, in a voice colder than the wind outside, "We'll let you know if he needs help. Until then, maybe consider minding your lawn." He hung up without waiting for her response. That night, after Walter went to bed, Ethan sat in the soft glow of a lantern. The cabin's silence was filled with creaks and the distant click of settling wood. A thick photo album lay open in his lap, his grandmother's handwriting looping around faded Polaroids. Tucked between the pages was something else. A folded HOA form, and signed but initialed faintly in the corner, BH. Beside it, a sticky note in Molly's familiar hand, "You were right. This isn't about fences." It wasn't just a meeting, it was a verdict. The Clark Pines Community Church Hall had never felt so full. Folding chairs creaked under the weight of anticipation. Warm cider steamed in paper cups along the back table, flanked by paper plates already dotted with crumbs of pumpkin cookies. Orange garlands and paper leaves hung from the rafters, but the mood was far from festive. The organ in the corner sighed out quiet chords, almost as if the building itself braced for what was coming. Walter adjusted his wool blazer and nodded at Denise, who stood at the lectern with a copy of the HOA charter in her hands. Her tone was clear, deliberate, as she read aloud the legacy clause, an obscure paragraph buried in HOA documentation that Molly had uncovered 2 weeks prior. "The HOA recognizes any resident of 30 consecutive years or more as a legacy member, whose rights to residence cannot be revoked except by unanimous board vote during active winter months, she paused, letting the words settle. Gloria stood across the room, her red sweater pristine, clipboard in hand like a shield. Let's not pretend this is about one clause, she said, stepping forward. This is about order. About setting standards. About preventing Clark Pines from becoming undistinguished. Ethan sat beside his grandfather, his arms crossed and eyes steady. He didn't speak, not yet. He just watched. Gloria's voice rose slightly. I formally motion that Walter Brewster's cabin be brought into compliance or vacated, in accordance with our existing policies on architectural conformity. Murmurs scattered across the hall like wind through dry leaves. Denise set down her copy and glanced at Walter. You have the floor, Mr. Brewster. Walter stood, cane in one hand, voice quiet but grounded. I moved here when folks still hung laundry on lines and argued over pie crusts, not paint chips. We used to wave from porches, not take pictures for violations. And I stayed. Through storms, through loss. Through quiet. I've lived here longer than this board, longer than that paint. I ask you to remember why we call this place home, and whether home should be ruled or remembered. There was no applause. Just stillness. The voting cards were handed out, beige slips folded in half. Each board member, including Gloria and Brett, received one. The process was quiet, save for the shuffle of paper and the sound of a pencil hesitating. Brett Harper sat alone at the far table, his lips drawn tight. He looked at his card for a long time before writing something, folding it, and walking slowly to the ballot box. He didn't look at his mother. A few minutes later, Denise stood again. Final count, 6 in favor, 6 against. The motion fails. There it was. A tie. A breath exhaled from half the room. Gloria's lips thinned. The town's gone soft, she muttered, slamming her folder shut with a sharp snap. She turned and walked out, heels striking the floor with finality. But the tension didn't linger. It softened, reshaped into something warmer. Janine set a cobbler dish on the table and laughed, guess it's time for an unofficial potluck. Others followed, Molly brought out her banana bread, Greg passed around apple slices from his thermos of cider. People stood in circles, shoulders relaxed. Ethan stepped outside to get fresh air. His phone buzzed. One new voicemail. Unknown number. He tapped it open. Ethan, the voice said, low and urgent. You need to see the HOA financials, we've all looked the other way too long. Not every secret is buried in silence, some are filed under miscellaneous repairs. The library's archives room smelled faintly of old paper and lemon oil. Ethan adjusted his reading glasses, squinting at the dim print of a spreadsheet photocopied too many times. The silence between him and Molly was only broken by the ticking of a brass wall clock and the soft rustle of budget binders. Outside, the sun was beginning to slip beneath the ridge, casting long blue shadows across Clark Pines. See this line item? Molly pointed with the blunt end of a pencil. Lot maintenance, $2,300, 3 months in a row. No vendor name. No corresponding work order. She flipped through another binder. And again. It's always lot maintenance. Same amount. Different dates. Ethan tapped a finger on the page. There's no trail. No checks, no receipts, just these entries, and the totals match deposits in a civic renewal trust. He didn't need to look further. The pieces were already clicking into place. Back at Walter's cabin, the wood-burning stove crackled, casting soft flickers across the walls. Walter stood at the kitchen counter, ladling warm cider from a worn enamel pot into stoneware mugs. Molly leaned over a crate of old HOA newsletters, while Ethan worked at the small dining table, assembling a short report. Greg arrived just after dusk, hat tipped back, cheeks flushed from the cold. Brett called me, he said without preamble. He's ready to talk. The knock on the door came a minute later. Brett stepped inside, hands buried deep in his coat pockets, his eyes restless. She's been moving the money into a shell account, he said quietly. Civic Renewal Trust isn't a real nonprofit. It's a name she made up years ago. Said it was for beautification projects, but nothing ever got built. Ethan nodded slowly. Can you say that at the board meeting? Brett hesitated. Yeah, he said finally. Yeah, I will. Denise met them the next morning outside the diner. She wore a thick scarf and kept glancing around, voice low. I reviewed the numbers. It's enough to call a special vote. I won't protect this. Not anymore. They decided the meeting would be held quietly, just a gathering, not an official hearing, but enough to share the facts. Walter insisted they keep things calm, respectful. Facts speak louder than outrage, he said, slipping pages into manila folders. And truth doesn't yell. That evening, neighbors began to arrive at the community hall under the guise of cider and cobbler. The air was thick with questions. Gloria wasn't seen at first, but eventually appeared near the back, lips tight, arms crossed over her red coat. Walter stepped forward, his cane lightly tapping the floor. This isn't an accusation, he began. It's a clarification. A reckoning, maybe. We found inconsistencies in the HOA finances. And we thought you had a right to see them. He passed out the copies, 12 folders, each with highlighted entries, timelines, and annotated statements. Ethan followed with a brief explanation, clear and steady. When he finished, the room was hushed. Then Brett stood. My mother's been using HOA funds to move money into an unregistered account, he said. I found the emails. I didn't know at first. But I know now. And I'm sorry. The silence cracked, murmurs, then gasps. Gloria didn't speak. She didn't move. Her cheeks were pale, and her hands clutched her purse as if it might anchor her in place. Denise approached, something small and folded in her hand. She paused in front of Gloria. This is for you, she said, voice gentle but firm. Gloria took the letter, unfolded it. A formal request for resignation. 11 signatures. 1 town. The eviction notice was gone. In its place was a hand-drawn card, Happy Thanksgiving, Mr. B. Walter stood in the chill of morning, the card trembling slightly in his hand as wind pushed soft flakes against the porch rail. The paper was thick, folded once, crayon colors bleeding into each other like a child's hopeful brushstroke, sunflowers, turkeys, and a smiling stick figure wearing glasses. He traced the corner of it with his thumb, then gently tucked it between the slats of the window frame. Inside, Ethan was setting the table. Still warm, he said, placing a covered dish down. Smells like cinnamon and, whatever your secret is. Nutmeg, Walter replied, stepping in and kicking off his boots. And a dash of sweet stubbornness. The house no longer felt quiet in the wrong way. A soft hum of the radio filled the kitchen, Moon River, crooning low. Ethan had found the station last week, the one Walter used to leave playing overnight after Marion passed. The enamel pot on the stove was steaming, cider laced with clove. The silence now wasn't emptiness, it was ease. News of Gloria's departure had spread quietly, respectfully. A single sheet of paper pinned to the community hall bulletin board, effective immediately, Gloria Harper resigns from her role as HOA president due to health reasons. We wish her well. No one pried. No one cheered. Denise simply nodded when Walter passed her outside Millie's the day before, adding, legacy exemptions been added to your file. Permanently. The gazebo near the town square was glowing by afternoon. Candles flickered in jam jars. Tablecloths fluttered. The scent of stuffing, cranberry, and spiced pumpkin drifted along the breeze. Families arrived with Tupperware and laughter. Greg rolled in with his truck bed full of folding chairs, honking twice. Kids ran in loops around the tables, their boots crunching frozen leaves. Walter's casserole dish rested between Denise's apple crisp and a bowl of something Brett labeled, not Mom's green beans. It drew a chuckle from the few who read it. Ethan stood beside Walter, shoulder to shoulder, as townsfolk mingled, shared bites, and exchanged recipes with practiced familiarity. "I've spoken with my firm," he said quietly. "I'll be splitting time between here and Portland. Remote setup's easy enough. Might even get some peace to think." Walter turned slightly. "This old place suits thinking." "I know," Ethan said, smiling. Across the tables, Molly passed a plate, her cardigan sleeves pushed up to reveal pine trees stitched along the cuffs. She reached for Ethan's coat without a word, folding it carefully over a chair as if it were hers to keep safe. As the meal wound down and people gathered leftovers in foil, Brett found Walter near the railing. "She did some good here too," he said after a moment. "Before it all got tangled. Thank you for not destroying her." He didn't wait for a reply, just squeezed Walter's shoulder and joined a group lifting folding tables into Greg's truck. The last glow of day slipped behind the hills. Walter sat on his porch, wrapped in his thick flannel, the vintage lantern flickering beside him. He held the framed charter Ethan had given him earlier, annotated in Molly's neat handwriting, with Greg's underlines in blue pen. The edges were worn, but the signature at the bottom still read clear: Walter Brewster, founding resident. Families passed along the trailhead. A new sign had gone up just that morning, simple, wooden, carved by someone with a steady hand. Clark Pines, a legacy of neighbors. He leaned back, mug in hand, the cold just enough to keep him grounded. The wind had quieted. Snow tapped the roof in rhythm. Somewhere far off, a dog barked and a screen door clicked shut. Then came the knock, light, familiar, on the porch rail. Molly stood at the edge, wrapped in a wool scarf, eyes bright against the soft night. "Care for one last slice of pie before the snow hits?" The porch light burned softly that night, not as defiance, but as quiet proof that home is more than rules and siding colors. What began as one man's stand turned into a chorus of neighbors rediscovering the power of shared decency. When control masks itself as order, it takes courage, and community, to pull back the curtain. Like the last leaf clinging to an autumn branch, sometimes all it takes is one steady voice to remind others not to let go. Perhaps it's never too late to stand with your neighbors, and keep the light on for what's right.